just about any place else they can be. That's where political advertising like this is being cranked out by special interest groups. So-called third parties are using sophisticated campaigns to target voters on Facebook, Twitter, etc., 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 and they have a lot of money to spend. Take a look at this. According to Elections Ontario, third parties accounted for 41% of all political spending during the last Ontario election. That adds up to almost $8.7 million. Joining us now, Jane Tabor, the Vice President for Public Affairs at National Public Relations, and Randy Rahameen, Principal at Navigator Public Relations. Welcome to you both. So, all right. We're also, we should point out, streaming this live on Facebook, and we want you to join the conversation. Head over to CBC News Facebook page, facebook.com/CBC News, and leave your comments. And during the commercial break, we'll be answering your questions as well. So, let's talk about what you think Ontario will find most surprising. I think the numbers are nowhere close to the U.S., what they're doing. But what do you find surprising about the third party?
I found it surprising last time around they were able to spend that much money. Things have changed, though, John, because there are new rules. And so the third parties are a little bit hamstrung compared to where they used to be in the last election. So they have to be very creative, devious, may we say, and how they get their message out there. But once they get their message out there, their people can segment, who's coming on, look at what they're interested in, look at what those supporters are interested in, and then start really drilling down and targeting messages that will appeal to them. So it's an effective strategy, and it's a lot cheaper than advertising on radio or television.
Well, that's the other thing. You potentially get a lot more bang for your buck, and you're reaching the people that you're hoping to reach by able to target them this way.
Right, and also the content appears organic. So part of the interest,
even though it isn't.
Even though it isn't. So we see, for example, with groups like Ontario Proud and other groups that seem like the content's just coming up from a grassroots perspective. In fact, it's mostly paid for by an interest group. Ontario Proud is one of 47 third parties that have registered in 2018 as a third party in this election, and that's part of what's changed this election over previous elections. Third parties now have to register and identify themselves, and there's also significant limits. So I think it's something like $100,000 that they can spend leading up to the election. But in the past, they've spent quite a bit of money. Of that $8.6 million that you saw, a significant portion of that was spent by unions. And so a lot of the pushback on the Liberal government was, the Liberal government introduced this policy in 2016 because third-party interest played a significant role in previous elections, specifically unions. We're seeing, though, a lot of the union support shift to the NDP this time around. That won't have as much of an effect on third-party advertising, but on the ground game, knocking on doors, pulling out votes, that's going to have a significant impact. You
mentioned Ontario Proud. As we understand, one of the men behind it used to work at Navigator.
Yes.
Let's have a look at one of their social media ads. Yes. Let's have a look at one of their ads. Oh, we may not have that ad for you. But, oh, I've been told to hang on there. Okay, more than 500,000 views on that ad. Whether the message is getting across, it's certainly being viewed by people, isn't it?
Well, it is, but the thing is, John, whether it's being viewed, you could just be looking at it or clicking through or whatever. So whether it's being shared, whether people are commenting on it, that's where you have to look, and that's where the parties and the third parties would be looking to see what the engagement is. Just because that many people have viewed it doesn't really mean a whole bunch. It means something, but you want the engagement. You want those shares. The ads that we're seeing too on the social media seem to be a lot more negative. The ones that are coming from the third party, the tone seems to be a lot more negative than the ones that you see from the parties. You know, with when we were talking about them last week with people running through the bucolic fields or whatever. We're not seeing that. We're seeing like really negative ads are coming out, and that Ontario Proud is one of them.
Well, but so being supportive, if it's of course not being the same thing as being tied to the party, the leaders don't necessarily have to answer for the tone of their ads. That's what we're seeing there too, right?
The bad cop, right?
Right, Ontario Proud is a Facebook group primarily that has about 375,000 members of this group. And we know that Canadians get the vast majority of their news from Facebook. I shouldn't say that on CBC, but they do get, I'm sure, a lot through CBC on Facebook.
Well, this is what happens. Exactly.
They do get a lot of their news from Facebook, and that's where the appeal comes from. I see even my mother sharing content from Ontario Proud because she perceives it as something that's just popped up in her feed.
Right, exactly.
So I think that it does have traction in the way that, let's say, an ad from a particular party or something coming from an established news organization might not.
The other thing is, this is the millennial election. There are tons of millennials. I think there's more millennials than my generation, the baby boomers, who are now able to vote. And that's where they are. They're all over social media.
Well, Jane, you've done some research into this, specifically around Twitter.
Right.
Tell us what we'll be looking at using maps tracking Ontario Proud based on Twitter.
It's kind of cool. So National Public Relations looked at all of the Twitter conversations since the writ dropped until I think it was on Thursday, just this past Thursday. And what they found was that, first of all, CBC Queen's Park is leading the conversation when it comes to media. No, honestly, it's there. That the National Post and Robert Benzie from Toronto Star, they are the conversation leaders in the news media portion. When it comes to the Conservatives, the people who are leading those Twitter conversations, one of them is Ontario Proud. Their handle is Ontario is Proud, I guess, because they couldn't get the right one, but Ontario Proud is actually spewing stuff out, sharing stuff, engaging stuff, and sending it out to its supporters.
Okay, listen, we're running out of time in this first block, but we're going to go to commercial and we're going to continue this conversation, and we'll be back in just a moment here on CBC News Network and still on Facebook as you are watching in. Okay, so we're already hearing from you on Facebook. Appreciate anyone who has written in. Curtis asks this: what are the current spending limits for parties? I'll turn that over to the panel.
I have to look into that number. Obviously much different. Well, I think that the way that they allocated spending numbers for parties this time around was based on the number of votes that you had in the previous election. So it's a certain amount per vote. We know that therefore the Liberals have the most spend.
But we can say, though, individually, those individual contributions in election campaigns have gone down significantly to something like $1,200, where unions
from
before
around
$25,000 or whatever. Yeah, it was unlimited before.
And the third parties that we're talking about is 600,000 up to an election and 100,000 after the writ is dropped.
After the writ is dropped, and then there are specific spending limits for each riding. So I think those drop down to about $4,000 per riding.
Yeah, it's way more severe than it used to be. It's not like the Wild West. Some people say it's the Wild West, but really they've really clamped down. In fact, Working Families, I think, was a coalition last time around that spent $2.5 million. They were helping the Liberals out, and they tried to fight the legislation in the courts. I'm not sure exactly where that is right now, but they have a constitutional challenge based on, I think, free speech or something.
Right. Continue to hear from people on Facebook. Adam Osmark on Facebook is asking about the Green Party. Any third-party involvement supporting the Greens?
There must be, but I haven't seen.
We haven't seen much in terms of traction. There are, as I mentioned when we were on air, there are about 47 third parties already registered. They started registering back in November of 2017. Some of them are significant, like large unions, and some of them are special interest groups that have very targeted, specific interests. So I think the limit is, if you're spending over $500, you have to declare yourself as a third party. So you can imagine some have skated below the radar, some have gone under the $500, but you can imagine you're not probably making that much of a dent in the election and in the way that people are.
One of them is an outraged Ontarian.
An outraged Ontarian.
That's the name. I was looking through the list today. An outraged Ontarian. There you go.
All right. Well, we're just about set to go from our Facebook Live, still on Facebook Live, but back into our regular programming, and we're going to continue this conversation. Welcome back. I'm John Northcott. This is CBC News Network. Joining us again is Jane Tabor, Vice President of Public Affairs at National Public Relations, and Randy Rahameen, Principal at Navigator Public Relations. We are live on Facebook. We'll keep the questions coming. Head over to CBC News Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/CBC News, and give us your questions. will give us your answers. We're talking about third parties and their influence on the Ontario election. The Liberals in third place. How will this play out in the campaign, do you reckon, as far as the third party's involvement goes?
Well, if they have any supporters left that want to help them out, they're going to have to really gin it up after this debate. And maybe this debate will provide some momentum to get some of those third parties, some of those other people in there to help out the Liberals. But right now, it doesn't look positive for the Liberals at all. It looks like they are losing momentum, and they've got to do something dramatic to bring it back.
Shouldn't the Liberals, after 15 years in power, have a social media / third party
strategy?
Terracotta army out there ready to step in? Yeah.
You could imagine after 15 years in rule, though, after 15 years at the helm, you've probably also upset quite a few people with different policies. And we see that with the elementary teachers, right, who've shifted their support from the Liberals to the NDP, only because they say the Liberal government hasn't been working with them in the same way, maybe given them what they wanted in labor negotiations. So you can imagine that after you've been in power for such a long period of time, you don't have as many supporters as if you have a clean slate and making promises to get elected. You know, what's interesting is the value of third parties, and in particular endorsements, actually goes up when people don't really trust the people that are running for office. And so I would expect that over the next couple of weeks, we will see a number of endorsements being announced. We saw Doug Ford announce that Hazel McCallion's come out in his support, but Hazel McCallion's also endorsed Sousa, the local candidate for the Liberals in her own community. So, you know, but those endorsements, those third-party endorsements, not advertising, but endorsements will play a huge role on social media and trying to influence, because you can imagine if you're struggling to figure out who to support, if your friend or somebody that you value says, I'm going to support this candidate, that's going to have some value to you.
Yeah, it makes a difference, and it made a difference over the weekend, long weekend. Last weekend, people were saying when families were getting together and actually talking about what was happening. It was the same thing in federal elections. If there's a long weekend in there, usually you see stuff solidifying after that long weekend, because families are influential too on how people are going, on how their family members are going to vote.
Yeah, and this has been a talked about election. There is no question.
Yeah.
Whether it's the gym, the family dinner table, the barbecue is getting a lot of, certainly anecdotally from my life. So I want to show you this Facebook political ad put out by Working Families, who spent almost $2.5 million in political advertising during the last Ontario election. Take a look. There it is there. So there's the know your parasites. And there's the lunatic after the deer tick.
How mean is that?
Lone Star. That sounds kind of mean.
Mean, that's what I'm saying. That these third-party support, we talked about the Working Families Coalition, they are a Liberal sort of group. They support the Liberals. They are doing the dirty work for a positive sort of campaign from the leaders who say, the leaders always say, well, we're going to run a positive campaign.
Sure.
We're going to do politics differently. We're doing it, we're taking the high road, right? Then they get these guys showing Doug Ford as a lunatic. Now, that's pretty severe.
But how direct is that line of communication? Because, I mean, in the United States, of course, you have super PACs who are kind of shamelessly in contact with there are some attempt at firewalls. But I mean, do we have Liberal Party, Conservative Party, NDP or Progressive Conservative Party, NDP operatives picking up the phones, or is it how is it done? Is it a blind trust? How do they get in touch with each other? How do they coordinate these things?
But just before we leave that, it may be mean, but it is memorable. You know, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and third parties are not. They don't have to come out with real rational approaches and policy statements and platforms. I know that we're missing one of them. They don't have to, but they've got messages that have traction, right? That image is something that you and I laugh about, but it's easy to remember, and they don't have to do a whole lot of work on policy, on getting into the weeds on a particular issue. It's much easier to be negative than it is to be positive. And so if you're running a campaign, though you don't have direct control over some of these third parties, they're certainly helping complement the message, because it's very difficult to win a campaign on a positive message alone.
Kevin McLeod on Facebook, another Facebook contributor, is the third party the new word for lobbyist?
No, I don't. No, it's a third party. It's a supporter. I don't say it's lobbyists. They're not out there. What, you think that they're going to get something in return?
Well, I think. The federal government sees it slightly differently, because you do have to register as a lobbyist to run a third-party campaign at the federal level. So I would say that's a very astute question, because yes, you are trying to influence policy for a variety of reasons. You might just like a particular candidate, but for some special interest groups, you're actually trying to influence a policy. So yes, in my view, it is a kind of lobbying.
but they have to declare. They have to say who they are. So we do. There is more transparency, at least this time around, than there was last time around, because we had no idea who these people were. Over $500, you have to say who you are and what you're doing as a third party.
Okay, fascinating stuff in what has been a fascinating campaign. 11 days to go. We'll see how it all turns out. Thanks, Jane. And Randy, Jane Tabor is the Vice President of National Public Affairs at National Public Affairs. Randy, someone put that in twice there. I thought maybe it was a very long title. And Randy Rahameen, a principal at Navigator Public Relations. Thanks to the viewers for joining us live with your questions on Facebook. You can catch the debate tonight at 6:30. You can watch it live on CBC News Network or online at CBCNews.ca. Still ahead, one man's journey to honor the victims of the Humboldt bus crash. Rance Cardinal walked over 1,000 kilometers from his home in Ontario. He has just arrived in Saskatchewan today. More on that coming up. This is